Jai Gurudev.
Jai Gurudev. Om. Brahmanandam Paramasukhadam Kevalam Jnanamutim Dvandvatitam Gaganasadrisham Tattvamasyadilaksham Ekam Nityam Vimalamachalam Sarvadhi Sakshibhutam Bhavatitam Trigunarahitam Sadgurum Tam Namami Shruti Smriti Puranam Alayam Karunalayam Namami Bhagavat Padam Shankaram Lokashankaram Shankaram Shankaracharyam Keshavam Badaraya Sutra Bhashya Kritau Vande Bhagavantau Punah Punah Sadashiva Samarambham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam Vande Guru Paramparam Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryankaravavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai Om Shanti 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 Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Chaiva Tato Jayamudiraye. Jai Gurudev. So we'll continue from here. Samsara is centered on doership. To know oneself as Akarta is to know oneself as Abhokta, one who is not an enjoyer. If you are not the enjoyer of the results of any action, then there is no punya or papa for you. And when there is no punya or papa, there is no sukha or dukkha, meaning that you are above sukha and dukkha. Sukha and dukkha, being the net result of karma phala, are also karma phala, the result of action. You may have performed a certain karma and received some money. Because of that money, you have a big house and are very comfortable. Because of all this, you are very happy. Being comfortable, being happy is a karma phala for you. Dukkha is also a karma phala. The house you bought turned out to be in a bad neighborhood. You were happy with the house until it was broken into and you were robbed. No matter how many new alarm systems you install, the results are the same. Frequent robberies and vandalism. So the same house that made you sukhi for some time has now made you dukhi, unhappy. Either way, it is all karma phala, punya and papa. You asked for it and you got it. Because all unseen results, punya and papa, fructify in the form of sukha and dukkha, all karmas are capable of producing sukha and dukkha for the karta. As long as I take myself to be the karta, I am subject to sukha and dukkha. To be subject to sukha and dukkha is what is called samsara. Sukha and dukkha themselves are not samsara. The notion that I am subject to them is samsara and makes me a samsari. So when we say dvandva titaha, it means a person who is above these pairs of opposites. Papa, punya, sukha, dukkha. So that means the person considers himself an akarta, is therefore an abhokta as well. Samsara is a notion. That the physical body is subject to pain is a fact. But if I say that I am subject to pain, there is samsara. I am subject to pain is different from the physical body is subject to pain. If you say the body is subject to pain, it is a simple truth because it states a fact about the empirical world. The creation is like that. The body endowed with the sensation of pain as a means of protection. Otherwise, one would not pay attention to it. Pain indicates that something is wrong and needs attending to. Therefore, physical pain is an important part of the creation. That the body is subject to pain is true. That I am subject to pain is an opinion, a notion called samsara. It is not true because Atma is not the enjoyer of the results of action. Karma phala bhokta. Atma is not the enjoyer because it is not the karta, the doer. One who knows that he or she is not the enjoyer is called kritsna karma krit here. When one is able to recognize oneself as free from doership, he or she becomes free from enjoyership too. That is why Gurudev says pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. So when we suffer, that means we are in samsara. We are identifying ourselves with the pain. I am subject to pain. Being free from enjoyership means that the punya and papa standing in one's account are all taken care of. Such a person who is free from a sense of doership and enjoyership is called a kritsna karma krita. For him, everything that has to be done now or later has been done. No new incarnation has to be taken by the person. No karma remains to prompt another birth. In this life also, whatever the person thought he or she would do is gone because the person is Ananda, Purna, fullness itself. He or she is above Sukha and Dukkha, liberated from the subjugation of karma and therefore Kritsna Karma Krita. So the one who knows that he or she is not the enjoyer is called Kritsna Karma Krita. That is, he has done everything that has to be done and there is nothing for him to do later. Which means there is no other birth for him. He is free from samsara. Inaction is not the absence of action. One who is Kritsna Karma Krit sees very clearly that there is no action whatsoever in action. Karmani karmani akarma darshanam, and that there is action in inaction. Akarmani karma darshanam. In his understanding, inaction, akarma, the so-called absence of action, is converted into action because of the presence of the karta. The one who says, I perform this action, is the same one who says, I do not perform this action. To say, I do not perform this action does not mean there is no action, because this particular inactivity is dependent upon and is centered on the karta, the doer. Kartavya is the notion that I am the doer, aham karta. Because this notion is there, the person says, I do not perform this action now, which does not mean that he or she does not perform any action at all. While the person may not perform certain actions, he or she continues to perform some action or the other. No one can remain, even for a moment, a second, performing no action whatsoever, as we saw in the 3rd chapter. That is, nahi kaschit kshanamapi jatu tishtatya karma krita. Therefore, it is impossible for anyone to say, I am not doing any action. Even making such a statement is acting, because speaking is an action. A person who says, I perform no action at all, I am keeping quiet, is performing the action of speaking. There is no such thing as inaction in the sense of a total absence of activity. When Krishna says that the wise person is able to see action in inaction, he means that the person does not see inaction as an absence of action. What the person is able to see in action is freedom from action, not the absence of action. In the absence of action, there is action, and even in that action, the wise person called Buddhiman is able to see a freedom from action. The Buddhiman has the wisdom, the Buddhi, that enables him or her to see inaction in action, because the person sees the Atma as Akarta. Thus, there is the recognition of the fact that the self is not an actor in any way whatsoever. The self does not perform any action, and in its absence, all activities take place. The original sin is ignorance. The problem here is that all actions are centered on the karta, the actor. Only when the karta is there is the possibility of action. Therefore, all actions emanate from the karta, which is not separate from aham, I, the atma. The problem comes because the person thinks that he or she is the karta. This thinking, this particular notion, is the only evil there is. If there is such a thing as original sin, it is only in thinking that oneself is the karta, because from this all problems arise. I am the karta is a notion, and it is this notion that binds a person to karma. Why? Because the one who is the enjoyer of the result of action is the one who performed the action. Karta eva bhokta bhavati. When I perform an action, a result accrues. And this result accrues to me, the karta alone. In this way, I am bound by the results of my actions, and thus by the actions themselves. Even a person who makes money and distributes it to all others, leaving none for himself or herself, accrues the result of a good action. People rightly exalt such a person which is a karma phala that belongs only to the person who distributed the money. But the person is still a karta to whom karma phala accrues, because of which he or she is also an enjoyer. Samsara, the orbit of action and result. Karma and its results, karma phala, are the cause for samsara. They account for all of one's problems. The results of karma in the form of punya and papa, according to this particular model, account for one's incarnation also. We have seen that karma is born out of desire, kama, and is therefore nothing but an expression of desire in the form of likes and dislikes, raga and dveshas. Although samsara is accounted for by karma phala itself is only possible because there is karma, which in turn is possible because there is kama, desire. And for whom is the kama? The karta. Therefore, karta is the cause for all the karmas and karma phalas. And because of ignorance, one takes oneself to be the karta. The problem here is that if you are really a karta, you have no way of getting out of samsara. You are in its orbit. The orbit of action and its results. Karma chakra. Because of karma phala, there is birth, janma, and because of birth, there is karma to perform. If one is able to gain a human body or its equivalent, then you perform new karmas and gather more karma phalas, thereby perpetuating the cycle. Because of karma, there is karma phala. Because of karma phala, there is janma. Because of janma, there is karma. And because of karma, there is karma phala. An orbit you will continue to be in as long as you take yourself to be the karta. There is no way of getting out of this wheel of samsara, the samsara chakra, unless you get out of the orbit of karma, karma phala, janma, karma. And how do you get out? The only way is to nullify the kartritva, doership. If the doership is real, you will not be able to nullify it, because anything real cannot be nullified. By the same reasoning, if doership can be nullified, it is not real. How to get out of the orbit of samsara? There is an argument that suggests that by performing only good karmas, a person will be liberated from samsara. This cannot be true. To perform only good karmas means that all the actions done by a person have to be good. There would be no wrong actions at all. This is not possible at all, as we shall see later. A person doing only good actions will gain only punya, but gaining any amount of punya will not release the person from this cycle. Punya being karma phala, the person with a lot of punya will have a lot of births and maybe a lot of what we call comforts. And the tendency of a person who has more and more comforts in the form of money and power, for example, is eventually towards wrong actions. The more money a person gathers, the more power he or she may have, and power tends to corrupt the person who has it. And if, by having gathered so much punya, a person could conceivably gain absolute power, then the person may become absolutely corrupt. This absolute corruption will then result in the accrual of papa, for which more births are gained. Furthermore, it is impossible for a person to perform only good actions, punya karma, No one can avoid doing papa karma at some time or the other. All it takes is one unconscious swatting of a mosquito. Unknowingly, you are destroying millions of bacteria every day. Nor are all the varieties of papa karma known to you. Some are unknown also. Therefore, you cannot avoid doing papa karma altogether. Even if you could do nothing but punya karma, you would not get out of the orbit of samsara. Karma itself keeps the samsara going. Only when the karta is not there will there be the absence of karma for you. And if the karta is a reality, karma will definitely be there. But the karta is not absolutely real. It is only a superimposition upon the Atma, which is absolutely real. This means that while the karta, the doer, is aham, I, Atma, is not the doer. This being so, kartritva, doership, becomes mithya, something that has no independent existence, because it depends upon I, whereas I, the Atma, does not depend on doership. It is satya. So this fact that doing only punya karma will liberate you is the argument of the Purva Pakshi. If you remember, in when we did chapter 18, the Purva Pakshi says karma is liberating. So if you just do nitya karma, naimittika karma, and you avoid all the vishiddha karma, you will gain liberation, you will gain moksha. But this is very clearly explaining that doing only punya karma, number one, is not possible, because you are there's so many papa karmas that are unknown to you that you're doing. And as long as we have this um, karta punya papa karma phala, the cycle continues, because you take another janma to um, to enjoy or suffer the punya and papa karmas. The definition of mithya and satya: anything that does not exist on its own, anything that depends for its existence upon something else, anything that draws flesh and blood from something else for it to exist, is called mithya. That which does not depend upon anything else in order to exist is satya. In terms of reality, then, a shirt becomes mithya and the cloth it is made of becomes satya. The cloth itself becomes mithya and the yarn that makes up the cloth becomes satya. The yarn becomes mithya and its fibers become satya. The fibers become mithya and the particles that make up the fibers become satya. The particles become mithya and the concept becomes satya. The concept becomes mithya and Atma becomes satya. And at this point, a question may arise. If Atma becomes mithya, this question is not valid, because this entire inquiry is possible only because there is an Atma, which is Satya, that which is not negatable. I am neither the doer nor the enjoyer. Consciousness that is self-evident, which does not need to be revealed by anything else, is Atma, the self. The self alone is self-evident, and everything else is evident to the self, Atma, that is not the Karta. The Karta is something that comes and goes. For instance, there is no Kartritva, no doership in deep sleep. Since I am always there, self-evident, if I am the Karta should not come and go. I should always be the Karta. And if I am an enjoyer, Bhokta, I should always be Bhokta. But this is not so. Sometimes I am Karta, and sometimes I am bhokta. This means that I am neither karta nor bhokta. Karta appears when the mind, antakarana, is there. Doership, kartritva, means the status of being the subject with reference to any type of activity. Whether it is mental activity like perception, inference, and thinking, or physical activity. Any type of activity, a subject is always necessary, and this subject is called the ego or ahankara or karta. The word ego must be understood well because there are a number of problems associated with its general use. Definition of ego. Ego is that which owns up to any type of activity. For example, when I see, I say, this is my sight. The one who owns up to the activity of seeing, the one who is the subject behind the seeing or behind hearing, tasting, smelling, thinking, or doing anything, is what is meant by the karta or the ego or ahankara. To say that one should surrender one's ego to the Lord is a very common statement that is much too simplistic in terms of understanding what is meant by surrender. First of all, I do not know who or what the Lord is. And why should I surrender the only ego that I have to this Lord? As it is, I have only a few things, and these things are owned by this ego. If I surrender it to the Lord, what will I get in return? Everything, I am told. The question that would arise would be, if the ego is already surrendered, who will get everything? Once I have surrendered my ego, I become totally decimated. Then who is there to get anything out of that surrender? Nobody. Therefore, that type of surrender is useless. Also, the next question is, who is surrendering the ego? Somebody has to do the surrendering. It is the ego that has to surrender itself, and that is not possible. Again, if I'm wearing a coat, I can surrender the coat. I can hang it somewhere or put it on someone's shoulders. And when I am the owner of the coat, it is easy to surrender it. If I am not the owner of the coat, I can ask you to take it, but I cannot surrender it because it does not belong to me. Similarly, I am told that the ahankara, the ego, belongs to the Lord and that I must surrender it. How can I surrender what does not belong to me? I can only surrender what belongs to me. And if it belongs to the Lord, how is it that I do not know this? In fact, I think that everything belongs to me, including the Lord. Why else would I address him as my Lord? To address the Lord, I must be there. Because I am here, he is the Lord. If I am not here, where is the Lord? He is the Lord because I call him Lord. And if there is a Lord, and this Lord includes everything, then I have nothing to surrender. I have only to know. Furthermore, if I have to surrender to a Lord who is separate from me, then I am the ego. Who then is to surrender this ego? The ego alone has to surrender. How can the ego surrender? The one who surrenders is the ego. And being the one who surrenders, the ego can only surrender what it owns. The owner cannot be surrendered. If the ego has to surrender to the Lord, something else must be there to surrender it, which can only be another ego, because whoever owns up to the act of surrender is the ego. The ego requires an ego, which requires yet another ego. Thus, we find ourselves in infinite regression. How then are we to surrender our ego to the Lord? Surrender is an attitude. Surrender is an attitude, a mature attitude. There is no other surrender than this. Surrender as such is not possible for the ego because it cannot surrender itself. But with an attitude of surrender, I can deflate the ego. I can appreciate that there is nothing in this creation that is authored by me, that everything is given to me, including my physical body, mind, and senses. What is given to me is not mine. When I say, I am just a trustee, O Lord, and you are the giver, the ego is what tells me all this. Thus, surrender can be only in terms of attitude. Then how does one get rid of samsara? Only by getting rid of the ego, the karta. And if surrender is not possible, how does one get rid of the ego? In the name of getting rid of everything else, the ego remains in one form or the other because it cannot get rid of itself. It remains to say things like, I am the most charitable person around. Even a person who does not talk about his or her good actions may think of himself or herself as a humble person and say, I never mention all of the charities I have done. I don't boast about them. Ask anyone and they will tell you that this is so. The ego knows very well how to sustain and perpetuate itself in so many ways. Because the ego, the karta, is always there in one form or the other, it cannot be defeated, except by the one who undertakes an inquiry into who am I? A person can study every philosophy there is, and the ego will remain saying, I am a philosopher. Only when the question, who am I, is asked, the ego is in trouble. Who am I is asked, is the ego in trouble. Why? Because the ego, the karta, is really an imposter, a superimposition. There is no kartritva, no doership, in fact, because it is mithya, dependent on Atma. Negation by knowledge. When the truth of oneself is recognized, the ego does not go, strictly speaking. Rather, this recognition is what makes one see the ego as mithya. The going of the ego then is purely in terms of negation, vadha, or destruction, nasha, by knowledge. The word destruction is generally used in a physical sense, such as destroying an object that it no longer exists in that form. Here, destruction of the ego is purely in terms of negation, vadha. Negation by knowledge occurs when an object is there, but its reality is taken away. For example, you can enjoy the blue sky and at the same time, knowing that the sky is not really blue, dismiss its blueness. Or enjoying a movie, you can dismiss its reality. A child, on the other hand, cannot dismiss the movie as unreal because for the child, the elephants, tigers, and everything in the movie are real. The child may even cry, not knowing that the objects and situations in the movie are only appearances and therefore mithya. Until the child knows the movie is mithya, the movie will remain real. This knowing comes by negation, badha, understanding an object or situation and removing the reality of it. Similarly, the ego is not removed, but the fact that it has no independent existence is understood. And what does the ego that everyone has depend upon? What is it that exists independently without depending on the ego upon which everything else depends? The ego depends for its existence on the self, which is not the ego. Therefore, the self is the truth of every ego. There is one truth for every ego and everything that is done by the ego, and that truth, Satya, is called Atma or the self. The self is the very content of the ego, without which there is no ego. This one Satya, Atma, is not the ego and is a karta. Then, who is the karta? The ego alone is the karta. To be a karta, you must have thought, and this thought has its being in I, consciousness. Therefore, you say, I am the doer. Doership itself is a thought centered on I. What is to be understood here is that while thought is centered on I itself is not centered on thought. Recognition of this fact is not the elimination or removal of thought. It is understanding the truth of I.
Can you please repeat the paragraph?
To be a karta, you must have thought, and this thought has its being in I, consciousness. Therefore, you say, I am the doer. Doership itself is a thought centered on I. What is to be understood here is that while thought is centered on I itself is not centered on thought. Recognition of this fact is not the elimination or removal of thought. It is understanding the truth of I. Because even that is a vritti, no? Tattvamasi or Aham Brahmasmi is also a thought. It's an it is. So therefore, that understanding is what eliminates. It does not eliminate. It makes you understand the truth of I, the Atma, which is the Akarta. How does one know Atma? How does the ego know the Atma, you may ask? The ego generally knows everything else. But how can it know Atma? Atma not being an object of the ego. In response to this question, there are those who will say, the Atma will transcend the ego and you will know. But what does transcending the ego mean? Does the ego go away? Does it come back? If the ego goes away, there is no one there. And if having transcended the ego does not come back, who will be there to know the Atma? If such were the case, gaining this knowledge would amount to becoming a vegetable. If the ego is transcended in order to know Atma, it is definitely not going to come back. Therefore, this explanation is not acceptable. And if you transcend the ego, understand the Atma, and the ego comes back, who is it that who understood the Atma? It is the ego that has to understand the Atma. These kinds of statements about surrendering the ego and transcending the ego in order to understand the Atma are very confusing to people. Unfortunately, they are too often to be found in the modern books on Vedanta and must therefore be seen for what they are. The means of knowledge are for the ego alone. In fact, the ego alone uses the pramana, the means of knowledge available, perception, inference, and so on. The ego, ahankara, uses perception and analyzing the data gathered by perception gains inferential understanding also. Thus, perception and inference are in the hands of ahankara, the ego, the karta, the subject who, wielding these two instruments of knowledge, perceives and infers. A means of knowledge is always employed by a subject who is the karta. Therefore, it is the employment of any means of knowledge. Therefore, in the employment of any means of knowledge, there is a subject karta, an instrument karana, action, kriya, and the result of action karma phala. Whether a piece of knowledge or an action produces a result or not, there is always a karta behind it. Perception and inference wielded by the ego are not going to help you know Atma, because Atma is the very essence of the ego. Atma is that which is behind the ego, meaning it is the truth of the ego. How then is the Atma to be known? I'll read this one more time. Perception and inference wielded by the ego are not going to help you know Atma, because Atma is the very essence of the ego. Atma is that which is behind the ego, meaning it is the truth of the ego. How then is the Atma to be known?
But the
This
earlier paragraph said, right? The inference and the understanding happens in
ego.
the ego.
Yeah,
Mm. And in fact, I used to have these questions.
right. I think the next para will explain it. This is where Agama Pramana, revelation in the form of words, Shabda, comes in. When Shabda is the Pramana, the means of knowledge, the ego does not do anything. What happens is that Shabda creates a thought, a vritti, showing you that you are the Atma, that is Brahman, and not the ego. The consciousness that is Atma, which is limitless, is you. This is the teaching, the Upadesha, and it removes your ignorance of yourself. So when Shabda is the Pramana, the means of knowledge, the ego does not do anything. That is quite a deep concept that we have to get, right? So when the Shabda is the Pramana, the ego does not do anything. What happens is that Shabda creates a thought, a vritti, showing you that you are the Atma, that is Brahman, and not the ego. Like, for instance, Tattvam Asi, that is a Shabda, it's a Shabda Pramana, it's a Mahavakya. So that creates that vritti, that Brahmakara vritti, or even Aham Brahmasmi, for instance. It creates that Brahmakara vritti, and that vritti is the one that is liberating. That is the one that says you are not the ego, you are Atma, you are Brahman. The consciousness that is Atma, which is limitless, is you. This is the teaching, the Upadesha, and it removes your ignorance of yourself. The destruction of self-ignorance. A person who takes himself or herself to be the ego thinks, I am only this much. Nothing more is known about oneself than this. This ignorance, because of which the ego is there, is destroyed by the vritti, I am Brahman, which is born out of the teaching. With the destruction of this ignorance, the notion that I am the ego disappears. Nothing more is necessary. What happens to the ego in the wake of self-knowledge? When the ego comes, it comes. And when it goes, it goes. But you are no longer the ego because ignorance about the Atma has already been destroyed. You know that the ego is Atma, whereas Atma is not the ego. Knowing this, you do not get lost in or caught up by the ego and its activities. This knowledge of Atma once gained is never lost because you have no more ignorance about Atma. Even if the ego comes, Atma cannot be mistaken as the ego anymore. Ego is Atma, but Atma does not become the ego just because the ego came. Just because a perception comes or an inference is made, just because an action is done or a result is gained, just because something happens, Atma does not become the ego. Everything is Atma. Atma eva idam sarvam. And Atma is not any of them. This is so in sync with the fourth and the fifth shloka of chapter 9, where he says, I am there in everything, but everything is everything is in me, but I am not in them. Everything is Atma. Atma eva idam sarvam, and Atma is not any of them. When any action is done, the ego is there, but Atma is free from all action because it is not the ego. Similarly, the means of doing an action or its result is also Atma, whereas Atma is neither the means, the doing, nor the result. This truth being known, the person sees actionlessness in action. Karmani akarma darshanam. How beautifully Swamiji has derived this so logically. Knowledge is the only way to destroy ignorance about Atma. Agama alone, knowledge in the form of words alone, destroys the ego because you are not really wielding a pramana here. Rather, you are exposing yourself to the pramana, to the words. In fact, you are so exposed that you get shot by the spear of Brahman called Brahmastra. In the Ramayana, Rama used the Brahmastra to kill Ravana. Astra means a weapon that leaves your hand, and Shastra is that which remains in your hand. Astra and Shastra, not Shastra. Shastra is that which remains in your hand. The various forms of practice, such as prayers, rituals, and so on, are called Shastra. I think it's Shastra only. Whereas the statement, Tattvam Asi, you are that, is called Astra. It comes from a teacher and hits you. It is intended to hit you, in fact. The statement comes out like a bullet and hits the ego, causing it to die. When the ego gets exposed to the teaching, Tattvam Asi, it naturally dies, just as the many-headed demon Ravana did when he was shot by the Brahmastra. Tattvam Asi, the Brahmastra, destroyed the ego called Ravana once and for all. Rama tried various methods to destroy his enemy Ravana, but nothing happened. He would remove one head, but by the time he destroyed the second head, the first one was back again. This is like trying to remove all our desires. Just when we think one is gone, we find that another one has popped up in its place. Finally, Rama was told to use the Brahmastra. Only then did Ravana die. Only then did Rama get back his joy, Sita. When the weapon Tattvam Asi is used against the exposed ego, it is destroyed. Thus, you need not do anything except expose yourself to the teaching. This difference between employing perception and inference and exposing yourself to the teaching is what distinguishes this particular means of knowledge from all others. Exposing oneself to the teaching is lending oneself to an entirely different type of pramana operation. It comes from outside and destroys the ego by saying that you are Brahman. For this, no action is performed. You just expose yourself to the pramana with Shraddha, the faith that the pramana will give you self-knowledge.
Excellent formula, Ramaraj. This
Huh?
excellent formula. This is expose
Such a
yourself to that.
beautiful, yeah.
Yeah.
All we need do is expose ourselves to the teaching. That is, it is like exposing Ravana, the ego, to Rama. And with the Brahmastra that Rama uses, the 10-headed ego, Ravana, is destroyed. And he gets back his joy, Sita. Such a beautiful explanation. The literal meaning, of course, is there, but the implied meaning of Rama killing Ravana and getting back his joy, Sita, is such a beautiful. And it comes from the teacher. This Brahmastra, the Astra, comes from the teacher in the form of the teaching Tattvamasi. It comes and it hits you like a weapon hits. So this exposing ourselves to this knowledge has two aspects to it. One is that you are doing the Shravana. Not only that, you're also doing it with an attitude of Shraddha. You're exposing yourself to the pramana with Shraddha, the faith that the pramana will give you self-knowledge. So therefore, it is so often quoted, Shraddhavan labhate jnanam. Because otherwise we might just keep reading this, but without the Shraddha, in which case it will only remain as a concept in our head. It will only increase and bloat up our already bloated up ego. Knowledge and error cannot coexist. Shraddha is not doing anything and at the same time being totally alive to the pramana, having abandoned prejudices about you, the world, and God. In fact, it is Shraddha that grants you this type of exposure. It is the attitude behind the exposure that brings one the knowledge. And against this knowledge, the ego is helpless because it is an error that has been corrected by the knowledge. No error is capable of standing as a coexistent partner to knowledge because knowledge and error cannot coexist. Nor can the error come back once knowledge has taken place. An object of error cannot return to the same locus where knowledge already is. You may question this statement using the rope snake example. You may mistake a piece of rope for a snake and remove the error by seeing that the snake is actually a rope. But the very next day, you may again make the same error. This is possible because the existence of both the rope and the snake depends on a means of knowledge, your perception. And because the defect in your perception can occur again, the error can also occur again. Whereas the existence of Atma does not depend on any pramana. The self is not first seen by you and then recognized, as is the case with the rope and snake. The self always is. Once the ignorance about the nature of the self is removed, there is no question of ignorance coming back. With reference to objects, out of sight can be out of mind. But Atma is never out of sight or out of mind. You may be out of mind, but you can never be out of Atma, the self. This self is not what is meant when people talk about the psychological self, biological self, anatomical self, familial self, or genetic self. These are subject to defects of every kind: genetic, pathological, physiological, and mental. Therefore, such a self is always unacceptable to you. Even anatomically, you cannot accept yourself. Your nose is not of the right shape, your hair is not of the right color, and so on. But this is not what we are discussing here. The self is different from all of this. Everything is the self, and therefore, there is no way of being out of oneself. When the ignorance goes, the ego also goes in terms of knowing I am not the ego. The ego that comes after this knowledge has taken place is not the same ego that was there before. It has become an enlightened ego because there is knowledge that there is no real self-existent ego. You refer to it as enlightened, Jivan Mukta, one who is liberated while living. This is the person that Krishna refers to as a Buddhiman in this verse. Knowing I am not the doer has nothing to do with action. Buddhiman, the wise person, is one who sees that even the so-called akarma, inaction, is nothing but karma. Yaha akarmani karma paschet saha buddhiman. And Atma being akarta, and because one understands this fact about Atma, he or she sees akarma in karma itself. And because of that, he is a buddhiman. Yaha karmani akarma paschet saha buddhiman. The person recognizes the fact of Atma being actionless, and that recognition, if it really is a recognition, is not altered whether karma is done or not done. This recognition has nothing to do with karma. It is the recognition of the Swarupa, the nature of Atma. You do not become a non-doer. You are already a non-doer. When we talk about the Swarupa of Atma, we say that Atma is essentially a karta. This statement is made with reference to kartritva, doership, that is superimposed on the Atma due to ignorance. Generally, one has the mistaken notion, I am a doer, aham karta. And the correlation of this mistake makes you see that you are a karta. That you are a karta is a fact to be recognized. Therefore, you cannot ask, when will I be able to become a karta? Nowhere is it said that you have to become an akarta, a non-doer. Only that you must see a karma in karma itself. There is no question of your becoming a karta. You are a karta. Atma is a karta, and to be a karta, you only have to see the fact. Then you are a buddhiman, a wise person. Among all people who have buddhis, but do not use them. Should I stop here? Because this goes on for a little longer. I think we've done quite a bit. We'll do some manana on this now. So the concept of ego and surrendering ego was very clearly dealt with by Swamiji in that it is not an action, because who is the one that is surrendering? So therefore, surrendering ego is only an attitude, and it is more an understanding. And the questioning, who am I, is what is going to get you to that state of dissolving the ego. Because ego is not just in action, it is also thinking. Because he gives the example of a person who does a lot of charity. He can express itself outside and say, I'm doing all this charitable work. But even if he does not express it out, he might still be thinking in his mind. So that is also being caught up in the ego. So how do you get out of the ego? Is just by understanding that you are the Atma, by the Badha, negation. And for the ego to be there, Atma is required. Atma, because of Atma, there is ego, but Atma is irrespective of the ego. It exists independently of the ego, because ego is only a superimposition upon the Satya. It is Mithya, which is a superimposition upon Satya. And Satya is what is. It does not depend on anything else for its existence. That beautiful example that Swamiji gave about the shirt. The shirt is there, but the shirt is made of cotton. So shirt is mithya because its existence depends upon the cotton. And cotton is satya. And then he goes on, cotton is mithya, the fiber, the yarn is satya. And the yarn is mithya, the fibers are satya. The fibers are mithya, the atoms and molecules are satya. So it goes on and on and on. And ultimately, what remains is Atma, the truth. And someone might question, what if Atma is also mithya? It cannot be, because that is the truth. I mean, without that, there is who is the one who is questioning that? That I is the Atma. And when you come from that space of identifying yourself with the Atma, when you realize that Buddhiman, he knows that the Atma is Akarta, then for him, he sees Karmani Akarmaya Paschet and Akarmani Karmayacha. So he sees action in inaction and inaction in action. like in deep sleep, there is no karta over there, but the I is there. Because for any action, there requires a thought. And behind the thought is a desire, kama. So this desire, kama, thought and action continues and gives you karma phala, punya or papa. And this is what keeps the cycle of samsara on. So the more you identify yourself with the karta, the more you are bound by your karma and therefore you are in samsara. So the wheel of samsara, the samsara chakra continues. I think everybody else can also share your understanding and your takeaways.
It's rightly explained the way we think, like going beyond ego. And then once you know the uh, Atman, what happens then? You come back to you. I mean, so nicely he has put, and this is what I used to have these thoughts. Like once you know Atman, then again do you come back, and then that time do you forget about it? What? I mean, these questions, how nicely Swamiji has put. Actually, this is what was happening in my mind.
I like this, expose yourself to knowledge, And he says, for that, with Shraddha. Now, he says, Shraddha is no, without any prejudice, getting aligned with the knowledge is Shraddha. So beautiful this is really. I love it.
And how Shabda is the one that there's this particular paragraph where he says Shabda is the one that liberates you. Where is that? That is why the pramana, the agama pramana, because there's no action over there. That is why Shabda, there is no action for Shabda, isn't it? One second, right? That beautiful. See, perception and inference wielded by the ego are not going to help you know Atma, because Atma is the very essence of the ego. Atma is that which is behind the ego, meaning it is the truth of the ego. How then is the Atma to be known? This is where the Agama Pramana, revelation in the form of words, Shabda, comes in. When Shabda is the Pramana, the means of knowledge, the ego does not do anything. What happens is that Shabda creates a thought, a vritti, showing that you are the Atma, that is Brahman, and not the ego. The consciousness that is Atma, which is limitless, is you. This is the teaching, the Upadesha, and it removes your ignorance of yourself. Because in the previous para is a means of not. This is actually how does one know the means of knowledge are for the ego alone. In fact, the ego alone uses the pramana, the means of knowledge available, perception, inference, and so on. The ego, ahankara, uses perception and analyzing the data gathered by perception gains inferential understanding also. Like how each one of us is understanding what we're reading. Thus, perception and inference are in the hands of Ahankara, the ego, the Karta, the subject, who, wielding these two instruments of knowledge, perceives and infers.
Here there is a little confusion. I mean,
What
is
is
that
it?
not a Vivek Buddhi? We say that inference and understanding or deciding factor. Here it's been said that ego does that work.
Yeah, it is the ego, isn't it? Otherwise, we all of us will not be sitting here. It is it is the I that is listening to. It is ingesting this, getting having an understanding. All that is happening where in the ahankara, isn't it? If we were all fast asleep.
If I may come in here,
Yes, please.
from the perception fatigue point of view, in the corporate world, we used to use the word perception fatigue. And what it meant was, see, something like what Gurudev has given a course point, opposite values are complementary, one enhances the value of the other. So when we came into the scriptural knowledge here, talked about Rama hitting an arrow, removing one head, and another would take its place. So Ravan is also equally important. Without Ravana, who would worship Ram today? And that is opposite values. So actually, Ravana enhances the value of Rama. So this is only possible because of our ego state, where we are saying that this is right, this is wrong, he is good, this is evil, Rama is good, Ravana is evil. Whereas Gurudev has said that opposite values are complementary, they have to coexist. One enhances the value. Like in a movie, the hero is treated like a god only because the villain comes into the picture. So it's an ego state, where our perception is that this is evil or this is. Jai Gurudev. This is what came to me.
Mm. So a means of knowledge is always employed by a subject who is the karta. Therefore, in the employment of any means of knowledge, there is a subject karta, an instrument karana, action kriya, and the result of action karma phala. Whether a piece of knowledge or an action produces a result or not, there is always a karta behind it. Perception and inference wielded by the ego are not going to help you know Atma, because Atma is the very essence of the ego. Atma is that which is behind the ego, meaning it is the truth of the ego. How then is the Atma to be known? This is where Agama Pramana, revelation in the form of words, Shabda, comes in. When Shabda is the Pramana, the means of knowledge, the ego does not do anything. What happens is that Shabda creates a thought, a vritti, showing that you are the Atma, that is Brahman, and not the ego. The consciousness that is Atma, which is limitless, is you. This is the teaching, the Upadesha, and it removes your ignorance of yourself.
So when I say I now over here, it's the ego, and behind that is a Atman. Essence of that is a Atman. Is that what
Yeah.
is meant here?
Mm.
Mhm.
And just like how Rama wields the Brahmastra, the words Tatvamasi, the words that come out from the teacher and the teaching hit you like a weapon, like an astra, and then remove the ego. What is ultimately required is, again, coming back to basics, is removal of ignorance, removal of this notion that we are what is enlightenment is our uh, removal of the identification that we are all the other 6 layers of existence. And then what remains is just the self. So you are the self, that realization happens. But whereas getting bondage is that you identify yourself with all the other 6 layers. And it was also very beautifully described how yam gatva yam labdva naparam lab. It's a point of no return. Once you realize this, once you get this knowledge, it is not like the example that was given, the rope and the snake. You may have recognized that the mistaken notion of snake is actually the rope on one particular day, but you might repeat the same mistake tomorrow. But this knowledge is not like that, because it is what is. See, this knowledge of Atma once gained is never lost, because you have no more ignorance about Atma. Even if the ego comes, Atma cannot be mistaken as the ego anymore. Ego is Atma, but Atma does not become the ego just because the ego came. Just because a perception comes or an inference is made, just because an action is done or a result is gained, just because something happens, Atma does not become the ego. Everything is Atma. Atma eva idam sarvam. And Atma is not any of them. And there was also an example of how um, uh, the child sees a movie as real, whereas a person who understands that it is only a movie realizes it. For him, it's only a movie, whereas he's just witnessing it. Whereas for a child, everything therein is kind of is real. The elephants, the characters, he even cries. So realizing that the world is nothing but a movie, that it is all mithya, that it is the snake that we are superimposing upon the rope, and that Atma is akarta. Atma does not do anything. It is actionless. That state is the state of being a buddhiman. And that is our goal. So this statement again, this paragraph, when the weapon Tattvamasi is used against the exposed ego, it is destroyed. So this term exposed ego is very beautiful, isn't it? As long as you're protecting your ego, as long as you're holding on to it, it is not exposed. Thus, you need not do anything else except expose yourself to the teaching. So we expose our ego to the teaching. This difference between employing perception and inference and exposing yourself to the teaching is what distinguishes this particular means of knowledge from all others. Exposing oneself to the teaching is lending oneself to an entirely different type of pramana operation. It comes from outside and destroys the ego by saying that you are Brahman. That is why the Veda is the pramana, the way Agama is the pramana, Shabda is the pramana. So that is the thing that is coming from outside. For this, no action is performed. You just expose yourself to the pramana with Shraddha, the faith that the pramana will give you self-knowledge. Anybody else wants to share? So how do we apply this in our day-to-day life? How do we apply all this knowledge that we've, that we have read till now and understood? That's simple, that beautiful. Initially, when Swamiji talks of pain, that pain is there is a reality. That the physical body goes through pain is a fact. But that I identify myself as the one who's having the pain, I am subject to pain, that is the bondage. Just like how Gurudev says, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. So this is our takeaway, I suppose. So if we are able to see things as they are, for instance, if there is pain in any part of your body, you're having a headache, for instance, there is headache is there, and the pain is important, so that it is an important integral part of your existence because it helps you survive. Because there is pain, you will take some action to take care of it. But then you can detach yourself from the pain in that you do not need to suffer the pain. But the problem is, all along our life, we have so identified ourselves with the sensations that we go through that we are not able to detach ourselves from that. So that will be our sadhana, where you can see yourself, see the thing as if you're seeing a movie. If you can see whatever is happening in our body, in our mind, just as how we see a movie, we can come from that space of witness consciousness. Then we will be in that space of akarta, the space of the non-doer. And then whatever papa punya that we experience, sukha, dukkha, we will just be a witness to that. We will not be a bhokta. We will not become an enjoyer of that. Enjoyer or sufferer, either way.
One is the physical pain causing mental anguish. And another is physical pain is of the body, and that is causing mental anguish. The second is the mental anguish caused in our relationships with people, the employer-employee relationship. Maybe there is a stubborn boss or something like that, or a mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship. All this, I think, only our perception, what is talked about in the last para that we covered, our inferences due to our perceptions need to be changed. And all these perceptions are there because we hold ourselves as separate identities from other people in and around us. We are not all one. And that is ego, is what I feel. And these perceptions and inferences that we draw can only be corrected by all the 5 course points that we have got in our part 1 course. Then we can circumvent the ego and reach the Atma state. The perceptions are so uh, uh, completely imposed on our mind, they are stamped on our mind, all our old perceptions. And they are the cause of all our, we need to change from with the scriptural knowledge.
Very true. Over the years, we have come to identify ourselves with the body, mind. So that it's so deep rooted, all that identification. We slowly have to release that with this understanding. And that is exposing our ego to this knowledge. No? That is the Shastra Pramana. That is the Shravana that we need to. Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. When we do that, we are exposing our ego to all these astras. And finally, that Brahmastra comes and is the final blow.
The Brahmastra, that is like, like when we are in this higher level of knowledge and we are continuously in knowledge, then that realization of Tattvamasi is also more deeply enrooted in us. We are moving from the ego to the self state. We are in transit.
Correct.
I think the most important thing is the application of this knowledge now for all of us.
Right.
Yeah, that is with Shraddha. The application of knowledge is pramana, you see. With Shraddha, that pramana will give you self-knowledge. So good.
Shraddha is not doing anything and at the same time being totally alive to the pramana, having abandoned prejudices about you, the world, and God. In fact, it is Shraddha that grants you this type of exposure. See, because all of us have an element of Shraddha, we are all able to actually be part of this knowledge, isn't it? If that element of Shraddha was not there, we would be somewhere far away. I mean, not even anywhere close to this knowledge. It is the attitude behind the exposure that brings one the knowledge. And against this knowledge, the ego is helpless because it is an error that has been corrected by the knowledge. No error is capable of standing as a coexistent partner to knowledge because knowledge and error cannot coexist. It is like darkness and light cannot coexist. Once you bring in light, darkness has to go. So similarly, with the knowledge that Brahmastra, Aham Brahmasmi, that happens, ego, there is no way ego will remain. And it cannot come back. There is only light.
The wonder for me has always increased over a period of time. In our time when we started, we did not have teachers for, like you have horses for courses. There was nothing like corporate courses separately. Then if you want to go to the medical fraternity, it would be a separate group of teachers going. it was not like that. Everything was very common at that time. So we
Yeah.
had to have a lot of knowledge about everything. And then when you scientifically study everything like gluten-free diet, lactose intolerance and all that, when we are talking on subjects in like the food, the white, these things, uh, poisons and all that, it comes in so handy. And like whatever Gurudev has given, like all my scientific these things to prove the cost points right, or whatever Gurudev has said, it has come in so helpful. I am left in wonderment afterwards, like, oh wow, simply we just need to follow what Gurudev has said. We don't need to apply our mind at all. And that faith is, like, I just have everything that he says is the truth. Nothing needs to be studied any further. Like
Yeah.
the
Very
scientific.
Only those 5 points, will lead you to that. Ultimately, he has filtered, filtered, and simply he has given us those 5 points. Such a wonderful knowledge in those 5 points only.
Talked about sadhana, seva, satsang. I have found that correlation, like he has casually said it. And he says, give as much time as you want to it. Even if you have 10, 15 minutes, it's all right. He has been so compassionate to us. But the moment when you study, as to see, when I studied the 5 pranas, and I went on, I said, oh, warm up is so important. For what reason it is important? And how, if our foundation, our body is strong, then we can go out and carry out any amount of seva. Na? Of course, there will be degrees of seva that people do. But for a person like me, the amount of seva to be done, the body has to be fit. How much everything is correlated. And then the mental language goes down when this application of the knowledge is there. So wonderful. Like everything is necessary, has compartmentalized it. Seva, sadhana, satsang. Wonderful. Like
Therefore, it is called art of living, completely full.
And it is up to each one of us how deep we want to go. Are we satisfied just keeping our legs in the water, in the ocean? Or do we want to dive deep and get all the precious stone? That is our Purushartha. So on that note, I think we will wind up here today. It was very beautiful.
Persiji, I need your Pancha Prana.
yeah, it has been sent on email.
No. Brahmanaji, I didn't get my email. Shall I send email again?
I posted it to everyone. I will maybe check your email one more time.
No, I didn't get it, but I will tell it otherwise.
Let me check.
Otherwise,
I've
okay,
posted
please.
Yeah.
Suresh.sapare@yahoo.com.
Yeah, just send it to me one more time by WhatsApp.
Okay, then. Thank you.
And Persiji, I will connect with you today, a little later today, regarding the advanced course. I will just have a discussion as to the dates, and then we'll create the. We don't want to postpone that too long. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Jai Gurudev.
Jai Gurudev. Om Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat Shri Krishna Arpanamastu.